Welcome to everyone. I'm Professor Hilary Brown, and I'm pleased to introduce this interdisciplinary project. It's an 8-week collaborative assignment for my case studies and sustainability course. And here's the brief agenda. So the slide presentation is going to start with key information provided by 2 sustainability program graduates who've been working on the project, Nuri Gutierrez and Veronica Franco, both from Colombia, who brought this project idea forward. And then it will be followed by the student teams themselves giving their presentation. At that point, we'll unmute our 4 participants for comments and questions. Please note that the slides are numbered, so if you want to refer back to a slide, try to jot down the number. So let me just briefly introduce Professor Jim Biles of the Colin Powell School. Just give a wave, Jim. Michael Bobker, Associate Director of the CUNY Institute for Urban Systems. Catherine Glody-Silverman, who you all know, our Academic Program Manager. And Teaching Adjunct Michael Duffy, who many of you already know. So if other audience members have questions or comments, do please provide them really towards the end of the comment period using the chat function. That'll be great, and we'll see if we can get to those. I don't want this to drag on too long. So here is the objective of this modest development proposal, is to improve life quality and the resilience of the indigenous Wayuu communities who are living along the coastal regions of Uribia in northern Colombia. The project utilizes intermediate technologies to generate energy, potable water, food, and improve sanitation. It promotes immersion in a model of a circular economy based on regenerative tourism, development of local micro enterprises, and conservation of cultural practices. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to, I believe Nuri is going to take us on the next slide.
Next. So this project is located in Colombia, as Hilary mentioned, is in the Department of La Guajira. This department, which is the northeast tip of South America, borders with Venezuela and the Caribbean Sea. The geography in this department is characterized by 3 different main areas: the south, the middle, and the north. The northern part is called Alta Guajira, which where you find the Uribia municipality. Basically, the landscape here is desertic, some sand dunes near the beach, and a rainfall of 350 millimeters per year, which explains the scarce vegetation. If we go to the next slide, we will have a closer look of the area of the project. We have a main road that takes to the port, and a railroad as well, and the airport. We have a military base, we have the Caribbean Sea, we have here Hepirachi wind farms, and in the red circle you can see the location of our project, where you will see the development in the next slides, and the Hunain Klein indigenous community. But who are the Wayuu? The Wayuu community is an ethnic group that, in Colombia, that have their own organization, their own territory, their own governance and authority. They are organized by clans. There are 19 reservations in La Guajira, and they represent the largest group of indigenous communities in Colombia, with a total of 380,000 populations, which the majority are women, and the population is also very young. 70% of this population is under 25 years old. Next.
So La Guajira suffers from multiple structural problems. The lack of government action, depletion of resources, and corruption has made it #1 in poverty rates, with the highest percentage of unsatisfied basic needs in the country. El Cerrejón, the largest open coal mine in the world, is accelerating pollution and controlling the use of the Rancheria River and the water. The region is also experiencing illegal trafficking, and the influx of people from neighboring Venezuela has increased pressure in the communities. In addition to all of these, the region has experienced increasing temperatures that are causing extreme droughts and desertification, and a lot of its water. Next slide, please. Catherine. Can you go? Yes, thank you. So what used to be the Wayuu's traditional means of self-sufficiency, like agriculture and animal husbandry, is no longer possible. Over 90% of the Wayuu's animals have died, and this complexity of problems had led to a humanitarian crisis. According to Colombia's government, around 4,800 children have died of malnutrition and its associated causes in the past 8 years. 14,000 in total, if you sum up young women, elders, and teenagers in the past 10 years. Despite the challenges, the Wayuu is an empowered community that have managed to preserve their unique culture and adapt to the region's landscape and harsh conditions. Weaving, for example, is a common practice passed down from generations of women, and they sell chinchorros, hammocks, mochilas, jewelry, and they are highly valued in the global market. Next. This region is also rich in solar and wind power. Around 67 wind parks are expected to be built in the area in the next 5 years. The country is planning to expand the renewable energy portfolio from 2% to 9% in 2025. This end of the world type of landscape is its sacred dunes and beautiful beaches. It's not only attracting private energy enterprises, but adventurous tourists seeking to find adventure and unique authenticity from the landscape. The national government has multiple incentives to increase tourism in the region. Yet today, the Wayuu, with their unique colors, culture, clothes, and music, are at risk of losing their ancestral traditions. Fortunately, we do have many things to learn from the culture and their mystical lands, with its untapped opportunities that we are about to see. Next.
Thank you, Veronica and Nuri, for the introduction. So we will start with the proposed designs now from the teams in the class. And my team and I will discuss water and sanitation provisions as well as soil improvements. And our objectives for each of the designs include capturing water on site, using low-cost ancient techniques to improve soil, and providing basic sanitation. So next slide, please. So our team is addressing the pressing issue of malnourishment and diseases related to mismanaged sewage among the population on La Guajira's peninsula. And some barriers we have to highlight, which also had to be considered in designs, was the inevitable impacts the region faces from climate change and corruption within the government that has led to poor management of basic water needs and led to increased migration rates from Venezuela. And so we hope that our designs will help resolve some of the vulnerabilities the people of Wayuu live with every day. And we will begin our design proposals by talking about how we plan to capture water on site. Next slide, please. So this is to be presented by Aparna. Aparna, are you here?
I'm sorry. I started talking, I think. You couldn't hear me. I'm so sorry. Let me start off again. So I will be talking about water, and before we talk about the solutions, I just want to highlight the water scarcity in the area. In a study done under the title Local and Global Climate Signals from Tree Rings of Parkinsonia praecox in La Guajira, tree ring chronology evidence is used to evaluate the average rainfall of the region. We couldn't find accurate record of climate data from the area because of faulty equipment and damages to equipment during extreme weather events. But what this data shows to us is that there is a bimodal rainfall pattern, and there is some rainfall during May, and then most of the rainfall during during the month of October. And this averages out to 397 millimeters per year. Another thing is that the region has little change in temperature throughout the year, which means that there is opportunity for continuous evaporation accompanied by low rainfall. And the region also stays humid and cloudy, which indicates that there's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Thank you. Taking what I said before into consideration, and the fact that our site is close to the sea, the abundant seawater available, and the sunlight with temperatures that average out throughout the year, solar still seemed like an ideal and cost-effective solution to obtain potable water. The solar water stills, we are planning on placing them next to the Seawater Greenhouse, which my colleagues will be talking about later, to allow transportation of water from its pump during the night. The water distilled in the stills will be stored in an uphill tank to allow gravity-based drip irrigation, which also my colleagues will be talking about in their presentations. The solar stills that we're planning on using are going to be of two types. The first type is a classic solar still, which can be added depending upon the need that arises, because it simply requires digging of a pit. The second type is a double wick solar still. The idea is to come up with a low-cost solution and use constructed ones to increase the productivity. And the wick has been added as wick allows water surface to increase and while staying efficient and relatively economical. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, the area is relatively humid throughout the year. A lot of the water stays trapped in the air. So the idea was to use a technology that can trap this water that remains in the air. So we planned on using the Warka water tower, which already exists in Ethiopia and other regions. It was designed by an Italian architect named Arturo Vittori. And we have planned on taking a taller version of his designs to adapt to the weather. And as there's a high humidity rate and the dew point is low, this might be an ideal solution. But also it's made out of cheap material like bamboo and can be installed by the locals present there. Another interesting factor is that it resembles the crafts of the local people with the weaving style. So it can serve as a tourist hangout spot and can be further developed to incorporate compost pits or agriculture in the future. Next slide, please.
The ability to raise livestock determines the wealth and the social status of the clans in the Wayuu community. So as the access to water and forage improves considerably by the overall proposals of this class, the possibility to increase the number of goats that are raised in the community also improves. These better conditions to raise goats will directly improve the access to food, while also providing a sustainable alternative for cooking fuel and fertilizer. Our proposal is to implement the use of prefabricated biodigester that can operate in full capacity by collecting the manure of 65 goats. During the day, the goats will roam in the grazing area, but at night they will be stable in an area nearby the main ranch area. where there will be a raised floor stable that enables the collection of the manure daily. This manure will be put on the biodigester and will generate 200 liters of biol that can be used as fertilizer, as well as 5 hours of gas that can be used for cooking. This biogas as an alternative to firewood fuel stoves will help prevent pulmonary diseases in the community, as well as the deforestation of the nearby areas, which is a problem currently. And the use of the biol will highly improve the soil quality of the area and the ability to grow food and forage for the animals themselves. The prefabricated system that we are proposing to use is installed by the Colombian-based company called Sistema Bolsa and has an approximate cost of $1,300.
Yes, so Aparna has discussed that La Guajira experiences extreme drought conditions, and this has led to semi-arid soil conditions that are often not favorable for growing crops. And the solutions we propose include drip irrigation, soil buns, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi inoculation, and compost. So these techniques are meant to be used in tandem with one another to help restore the soil. And the results of applying these techniques should help restore the soil by balancing the soil's hydrological system, closing nutrient cycles, and yielding food crops. So the techniques have been influenced from ancient African cultures and techniques. So you can go to the next slide. So to create a soil bund, one can simply use a shovel to excavate a trench and collect the soil in a pile next to the trench. For our design, we've suggested a 12-inch deep trench, which is intended to collect rainwater. And this is during the wet season. So the heaps of soil are structurally reinforced by shrubs, grasses, or crops planted into the soil bund. And then to ensure that plants and crops have the necessary amounts of irrigation they need, the soil bunds proposed are intended to be placed under solar agrovoltaic panels, which will help shade the trenches and prevent rapid evaporation. And then to further ensure available water, a drip irrigation system, as seen on the right, will be installed. So this includes an elevated 3-foot drum that is above the ground and has irrigation lines that run through the soil buns that are covered by a mulch covering. And then because of desert conditions, we have also incorporated a clay pot irrigation system to store water and then further restore groundwater recharge and to irrigate the crops. So the source of water for all of these irrigation mechanisms is rainwater caught via gutters installed on agrovoltaic panels, which we will see imaged later in another team's presentation. And you can go to the next slide. So these two techniques shown here, a compost box and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi inoculation, are both meant to provide necessary nutrients to plants and create diverse microbiota in the soil that's needed to ensure the viability of new plantings. So the compost box, as the name suggests, is a structure that can be built from stone easily, and inputs can include plant waste from the Seawater Greenhouse that we will learn about shortly, from another team. Vegetable and food scraps can be added, and any plant waste. And we want to ensure that all sources of nutrients and energy on site are tapped into. Cold compost can be piled and will yield nutrient-filled finished compost in about 1 to 2 years. And mycorrhizal fungi is an evolutionary partner of plants, and some plant species share a symbiotic relationship with this fungi, and it extends the roots and allows for water capture and more efficient nutrient uptake from the soil, and would be helpful in ensuring that these new plantings will survive. It could also help to bring education and educational resources to the area where people could study this type of new research coming out. And you can go to the next slide. So this is a diagram that shows the inputs and outputs of the designs we've proposed for water, sanitation, provision, and soil improvements. And that concludes our segment.
Who's presenting this?
I am. Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. Here we go. Great. So as part of the eco-industrial park being proposed today, our team will be presenting the Seawater Greenhouse complex that adds a combined value of food and water production, not only to the park, but also the surrounding Wayuu community, which is lacking both of these basic needs. Some of the objectives of the complex include major increase in production of nutritional foods for local community and visitors, providing ideal controlled growing conditions and reduced water use with the off-the-shelf simple low-impact construction techniques, extending agricultural production to immediate exterior of the greenhouse using the exhaust humid air from the Seawater Greenhouse, and local job creation. Next.
So the picture on the left is a rendering of the Seawater Greenhouse located in Somaliland. And there's the picture on the right is our proposed Wayuu project Seawater Greenhouse rendering. So the Seawater Greenhouse was invented by a British lighting designer, Charlie Payton, in 1991. He and his team have deployed this technology in multiple locations throughout the world, including the Canary Islands, the Middle East, Australia, and most recently, Somaliland in 2017. Interestingly, the Seawater Greenhouse has actually gone from a complex technology to a simplified version for Somaliland. So the Somaliland Seawater Greenhouse design is intended for water and food insecure populations without a lot of economic means. Hence, this is why we chose this version to determine whether or not it could be a good fit for the Wayuu project. Next.
So in terms of a broad overview, we hear endless stories about how the world is running out of water, droughts are happening left, right, and center, and how half of the planet is catching on fire. But actually, we're not short of water. It's just that most of it is too salty. A solution to this problem is a seawater greenhouse. A seawater greenhouse uses intuitive engineering to turn deserts into farmlands. In the past 50 to 100 years, irrigation has been used to increase the amount of food that's available, but it doesn't solve the problem of needing more water to grow more crops for a growing population. The seawater greenhouse, on the other hand, does. It enables the world to grow more food. Unlike a conventional greenhouse, which you could think of as a hothouse, the seawater greenhouse is the opposite. It is a cool house designed to cool, humidify, and create a climate suited to temperate type crops in hot, arid regions. The seawater greenhouse not only turns seawater or salt water into fresh water, but it also reduces the amount of water that a crop needs drastically by creating that cool and humidified climate inside. It basically recreates the natural hydrological cycle within an artificially controlled environment. And I'll let Kenya explain more of that next. Next slide, please.
So here's a conceptual diagram showing the components and relationships within the greenhouse complex, specifically the process of desalination and the conditioning of the microclimate for efficient crop production within the greenhouse. The notations on the lower end of the diagram show the steps of desalination. Step 1, the seawater is extracted from the deep ocean. Step 2, the seawater is brought to our site with the help of a well for pump efficiency. Step 3, the seawater is then stored in storage tanks. Step 4, as the seawater passes through the greenhouse, both fresh water and brine are produced. Step 5, the stage is where fresh water is further refined to become potable water. And step 6, salt is produced. Now for the functionality of the seawater on the top end of the diagram, I'm going to start from left to right. The front of the greenhouse is composed of a porous cardboard panel, which faces the prevailing direction of the wind. We have also added backup solar fans in case of insufficient winds. The seawater trickles down the front wall cardboard evaporator, and the air passes through it. It's cooled and humidified before it passes over the plant growth area inside the greenhouse. The evaporator also filters out dust, salt, pollen, and insects through its porous medium. This cool and humidified air creates a favorable growing condition for the crop within the greenhouse. Sunlight from above is also filtered out to remove radiation that does not contribute to photosynthesis. This air then passes through a second purpose evaporator on the other end of the greenhouse, containing seawater that has been heated by the sun in the ceiling pipes, where air is further heated and humidified to a saturation point. Saturated air passes through the condenser, which is cooled using deeper seawater with a deep seawater that is relatively cooler. Distilled water is produced and is piped to a storage container to be used for crop irrigation. The leftover brine from this process is taken to the salt shed to be further evaporated until only salt remains. And that's the end of this process. Next.
So, so in considering the placement of the seawater greenhouse, we also have to consider the placement of the pipes within the system. So to best approximate where to do so, if you see the big red arrow in the map, and this map was actually aggregated from a fishing website, but it allowed us to see where the deepest areas are in the Caribbean Sea. That's right off the coast of the site that we're planning. And by picking a latitude area that is on the edge of the deep area, we're able to see what are the optimal depths we're looking for to optimize the energy system to have cold water go in and help optimize the way that we're actually funneling energy through the pumps. So we're looking for water temperatures that are around 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and also looking to be around 6 meters from shore, but with at least 10 meters depth for where we're actually harvesting our water to go into the overall system. We're looking for fluid dynamics. Lastly, we want to not interrupt the ecosphere or the environment next to the shore. And so there are potential to look into avoiding chlorophyll blooms and also wanting to avoid high elevation because we want to, again, optimize the flow of water. Next slide.
This is the previous slide. Oh no, never mind actually. Sorry, I'm confused. A seawater greenhouse is a low maintenance system and it only requires 3 inputs to function. These are sunshine, wind, and of course seawater. On this slide, I compiled a table of the average weather that Wayuu experiences over the course of a year and how it affects the natural inputs. These natural inputs are important for the functioning of the seawater greenhouse because they are direct inputs for important processes. Overall, as you can see in the table, these natural inputs are available abundantly. Sunshine does not vary substantially throughout the year because the length of the day on average is 12 hours a day. Wayuu is also located next to a large body of water, the Caribbean Sea, and seawater temperatures fall within the optimal range for functioning of the greenhouse. Winds, on the other hand, are seasonally dependent, but the lowest recorded wind speed is still within the optimal range. Next. For our project, Somaliland has served as a reference point for the implementation of the seawater greenhouse. Most recently, a seawater greenhouse was deployed in Barbera, Somaliland, and it has been a successful project. The climatic conditions of Somaliland are also very similar to Wayuu as well. Both Wayuu and Somaliland have near constant temperatures all year round, which makes the climate hot and oppressive. Rainfall is experienced slightly more in Wayuu than it is in Somaliland, and windfall in Wayuu is also generally more intense for most of the year in comparison to Somaliland. Now I'll let Patty speak more about this.
So the bottom 3 graphs are just a simple comparison of 35-year climate data to compare the precipitation, wind speed, and temperature of Somaliland versus the Wayuu region, where the Wayuu region is the blue line and the Somaliland project climate is the orange line. So the climates are comparable. Next. All right. The seawater greenhouse mechanical and electrical systems are very basic, and the components may be sourced locally with the exception of the reverse osmosis machine. So the seawater greenhouse is comprised of 3 main systems: the pumping system, the power system, so the pumping system, which is indicated by the thicker pipes in the schematic, the power system, which is indicated by the thinner lines, and then we have the reverse osmosis machine, which is what looks like a washing machine. So the pumping system moves the water from the sea through the system throughout the seawater greenhouse and eventually to the reverse osmosis machine to create potable water for the drip irrigation system and any excess surplus potable water for the residents of the Wayuu region. The power system is a simple solar PV array combined with lead acid batteries, essentially car batteries, which allow the system to run during times with no sun. The power system is sized to power the pumps and the reverse osmosis machine. The power system might be slightly oversized in that such excess stored power may be used as a community charging station, which is located on the top left. So the reverse osmosis machine is the component that is specialized equipment, which will be discussed in the following slides. You'll also notice there's the solar stills on the bottom left-hand corner. So the solar stills will not part of the seawater greenhouse technology, will be fed using the seawater greenhouse pumping system. Next.
I would like to make a note that the solar equipment are only for one seawater greenhouse. Our team plans to deploy 2 seawater greenhouses in Wayuu. The seawater greenhouse will be driven sustainably by solar energy. In it, we will use submersive solar pumps to pump seawater from the deep sea and surface solar pumps to pump seawater up and around the greenhouse. We have also decided to include a backup solar fan to maintain constant airflow during less windier months. Floating spears will be used in open tanks to reduce evaporation. I will let Devon talk more about the reverse osmosis machine next.
So we spoke a lot about desalination, both in the water team and in the seawater greenhouse team. And I want to talk a little bit about it. So the actual process of desalination not only happens through the reverse osmosis system that we're suggesting, but also through just the different ways in which we're using the wind and the moisture in the atmosphere to use for irrigation in the seawater greenhouse system. So very briefly, reverse osmosis is commonly used for desalination because it's low energy consumption and a simple application. The system that we're using for the actual humidity and water in the atmosphere is an evaporation wall, which is a one-pass system. But the reverse osmosis system that we're eventually suggesting is actually a multi-pass system that is directed to the left of the slide is a picture from Somaliland of an engineer working with the reverse osmosis system they have here. The single-pass one is modeled to the right. I'm going to pass on to Patty, who's going to talk about the on-site system specifics.
So we contacted Charlie Payton's group and they did confirm the following reverse osmosis system stats. So it does draw 1.5 kilowatts. It runs 10 to 15 hours a day and it produces approximately 1,000 gallons per day. They confirmed they also do create a small amount of surplus potable water, which is offered to residents during periods of lower consumption by the crops. The excess water is stored in approximately 500 gallon storage tanks, just to give you some sort of sizing scope. They also did acknowledge they're not happy with their reverse osmosis system, and they're looking for a new system when funds allow. So this is why I'm going to pass it back to Devon, who has done some specification or sourcing for a new system.
Right, so as recommended in the PowerPoint, we found the ePro commercial RO system, which is reverse osmosis system. And it could potentially provide 31,000 to 144 gallons per day with 99% purification of the water going in and also an 80% recovery of the water going in. And this is better specs than what was shared for the system that they use at Somaliland and quite effective too. As we mentioned earlier, that this will be one of the only parts of the seawater greenhouse power system that's going to be sourced outside of the country. So we wanted to make sure we were able to optimize the inputs and outputs, and also it fit into the power generated for our system. Next slide. So as Aparna mentioned, we decided that we wanted to give the people who were building and participating in this project an option to have water that wasn't really built on having expensive materials. So in addition to the fixed desalination stations that we were building, also kind of developed a little bit further the idea of the solar still. All solar stills are modular, but the idea is to optimize the parts that build up a solar still so that someone could pretty much just dig a hole and get water for either drinking or for irrigation based on their needs. So just based on the map sites we have, anywhere that this could be placed on the northeast side of our site would be functional just based on where the wind's blowing. But also we want to make sure that the equipment being used, for example, high surface area plastic, weights, which are diagrammed in the green blocks, and also drinking hose or a hose going out of the drinking container to go back into the uphill storage container. Next slide.
So here we have a site plan of the Seawater Greenhouse. It's placed past a 650-foot offset from the shore. This distance and location was modeled from the Somaliland greenhouse project that we mentioned earlier. Its location is just off the existing main road and the existing bird watching path. The Seawater Greenhouse site includes 2 half-acre greenhouses, one dedicated to temperate crops and the other to tropical crops. 1 salt shed and 1 storage shed flanked on the western side of the complex to maximize wind from the northeast for the greenhouse structures. 1 well and a few water storage tanks for the storage of seawater, freshwater, and potable water. The in-between spaces of the 2 greenhouse structures is used for the cultivation of more native agriculture to take advantage of the oasis effect we mentioned earlier on the southwest of each of the greenhouse structures. Next.
So here you can see the structural components that go into and plan that go into building each greenhouse. And like Kenya said, they are identical. So on the left, you see more of a roof plan, which shows how the poles create a grid. And on the north and south side, where the evaporation wall sits, the module gets smaller. And on the right side, you can see a way that the garden beds could be arranged to allow for circulation as well as working area. Next. So like I said, the module created is a 16 by 20 module, which allows, if the greenhouse succeeds, to grow and be replicated over time. On the right, you can see components that go into building. So you have these vertical poles. And then on the north and south side, you have 2x4 and 2x10 lumber that frame out the evaporation pads. Wires run throughout the structure. And then on top, not shown, is a canvas-like material that allows for both wind flow while keeping in kind of the temperate climate. Next. And here's a view of what inside one of these greenhouses could look like. You can see there's room for circulation as well as working areas and staging areas, and creates kind of a poetic space to be in. So that's kind of the whole of the Seawater Greenhouse. And while there are a lot of components that go into it, it's fairly simple to construct, and almost all materials can be sourced locally. And furthermore, it creates an abundance of vegetables, excess water, as well as jobs for the Wayuu people. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel, and Katie, Christina, and myself have been working on the agriculture, permaculture, and animal husbandry practices for our site. So the lack of potable water is one of the greatest threats to this community, as we've heard. So we are proposing agriculture and animal husbandry techniques that aim to grow food for the community to eat or sell while keeping in mind the high heat, lack of water, and extreme arid conditions of this site. Permaculture is a development of an agricultural ecosystem in which multiple crops are placed together to allow for exchange of nutrients and benefits to other plants. Additionally, we are implementing an agrovoltaic technique which combines photovoltaic panels with crops growing beneath in the shade to aid in the reduction of water loss. We're also integrating seaweed cultivation with mariculture. And lastly, we plan to use the PV panels as shade for goat grazing. Next. So this is just showing our overall site plan with the seaweed cultive in the water, the location of the greenhouses and the microclimate area for exterior intercropping, as well as the agro PV and terracing agriculture area in the back. I wanted to make a point that if you were to go to La Guajira now and try to plant many of these crops, it wouldn't be possible, but because we are hoping to improve the soil conditions and create a better environment for growing due to the seawater greenhouses, the soil conditions will get better and these crops will be able to grow well as the existing conditions are improving. Next. So my approach to permaculture has been through the practice of intercropping, which can be defined as placing elements in such a way to cooperate with and serve the needs of other elements, or the cultivation of 2 or more crops simultaneously on the same field. There are many benefits to intercropping, including spatial interactions, such as providing structural support or shade, trap crops, which can distract pests away from food crops, next, nitrogen fixation through the relationship that legumes have with certain bacteria that gives neighboring plants access to more nitrogen, just to name a few. So as we just heard, there will be 2 seawater greenhouses, temperate and tropical. Lettuce, carrots, tomatoes, and spinach have high nutrient values and grow well in the temperate conditions of a seawater greenhouse. Melons, cucumbers, bananas, and peppers grow well in the highest humidity conditions of the tropical seawater greenhouse. Additionally, the area between and around the 2 greenhouses creates a microclimate or oasis effect, as we just heard, where we are planning to grow watermelon, Wajaritos beans, desert marigolds, and citrus trees. And lastly, we plan to intercrop on the terraces behind the seawater greenhouses with my Wayuu interpretation of the traditional 3 sisters crops, applied here using cowpeas, sorghum, and cassava. And it will be the discretion of the Wayuu community on deciding which plants they will incorporate into their diet and which will be sold to restaurants and tourists. Next. So this top photo on the left just shows the interior of a seawater greenhouse in Jordan. It gives just a clear understanding of what the interior of a seawater greenhouse actually looks like and how plants grow within them. And beneath is the plan we just saw of our actual proposed seawater greenhouses. So the chart in the middle shows our 2 types of seawater greenhouses, temperate and tropical, and explains the differences between the 2 greenhouses in terms of temperature, growing conditions, and crops. So in the temperate greenhouse, the temperature in the growing area is a bit cooler with high humidity, and this is where we plan to grow the carrots, lettuce, spinach, and tomatoes. In the tropical greenhouse, the growing area is warm and the humidity very high. This is where we plan to grow melons, peppers, cucumbers, and bananas. And the photo on the right is from one of Nuri's friends who's a chef in La Guajira. The dish pictured shows a few of the crops that we plan to grow in the greenhouses, like banana, cucumber, and tomato. Next. So the oasis effect is a result of cooler, more humid air leaking from the sides of the greenhouses, which creates a local microclimate above the ground surrounding it, creating more optimal growing conditions for hardier plants outside of the greenhouses. Charlie Payton, the founder of Seawater Greenhouse, mentioned that this area is sufficient to support the growth of melons, citrus trees, and various herbs. So for this area immediately outside of the seawater greenhouse, I'm proposing we intercrop with fruit-producing plants, watermelon and citrus trees, and planting them with Wajaritos beans and desert marigolds to deter pests. Marigolds are also a great companion plant for most crops. They're a pest deterrent, and tall marigolds can act as a wind barrier. So this rendering of the oasis effect area shows the watermelon vines growing under and around the citrus trees. Citrus trees prefer southern sun exposure, so I place them mostly along the south-facing wall of the seawater greenhouses. Tall varieties of marigolds protect from strong winds, so I thought placing them along the perimeter of the microclimate made sense. And to maximize space, I decided to grow the Wajaritos beans along the walls of the greenhouses, with watermelon vines continuing in the space between and growing underneath the citrus trees throughout. And this area will be irrigated from the catchment area for rainwater on the seawater greenhouse storage shed and salt shed roofs to store rainwater when it actually does rain, specifically for the crop irrigation for this area. So we would have gutters surrounding the perimeter leading to a downspout, and then a cistern for storage. Next.
I'm gonna talk about the seaweeds in La Guajira. So a pilot culture of seaweeds was carried on the northern coast of La Guajira, and 3 crop species were cultivated, and they used 2 systems: the floating propylene monolines and the floating PVC raft. And the algae which works best is one called Euchemia, and the product that can be produced is a drink called Siamos. Next. So as I said, there are 2 types of cultivation. Here on the top left, we have 2 drawings of it. And one has 1-by-1 rows of seaweeds, and the other one has at least 2 rows on each raft. Moreover, we can see the grid design, where it has anchors, buyouts, strings to hold the seaweed into place and provide its growth. Next. Here we just have a cross section that helps us understand better how the system looks like in the sea. And as it was provided on the slides before, with its buyouts, anchors, and strings. Next.
So it will be touched on more in depth during the energy production discussion, but La Guajira has great solar potential. Agrovoltaics could be used as a solution here to increase crop production and improve conditions for animal husbandry in the area. The practice combines traditional solar field rows of photovoltaic panels with agricultural production. Several studies on the integration have shown an increase in the combination in the combined yield because of mutual benefits. The panels provide shade to the crops at the sun's highest intensity, limit evaporation from the soil, and contain evapotranspiration, creating a sort of microclimate. Animals can also find benefit from the shade, which is particularly significant when in conjunction with their food source. The panels are a bit higher off the ground than panels in typical solar fields, which allows for cooling from winds underneath. And the evapotranspiration also provides cooling, and both of those lead to greater performance of the panels. Next. So the agrovoltaics we're proposing will have 3 rows with 9 mounting structures in each row, and each mounting structure will hold 4 250-watt panels. To take advantage of the catchment surface created by the panels, if a gutter is attached to the lower end of the panels, any rainfall that does happen can be saved into a cistern and provide gravity-fed irrigation to the agriculture. Next. So this diagram shows 3 rows of photovoltaics, which we've combined with the benefits of terracing as well. The first row, which is closest to the Seawater Greenhouse, will be for the 3 sister crops and irrigated by the raised cistern. The middle and last row will be used to grow the feed for the goats, which we'll specify on a later slide. And the goats will be able to graze in the shade of the panels. The panels are oriented south at a 14-degree angle for maximum solar exposure. And next.
So cowpea is their most traditional crop. It holds spiritual meaning for the Wayuu tribe. It grows well in their soil. It's a cover crop, and since it's a legume, it has nitrogen fixing nodes on its roots that transform atmospheric nitrogen, which most plants can't use, into soil-bound nitrogen, which all plants need. So I was thinking using it for intercropping in the area would be appropriate culturally and beneficial to the soil profile. So in the first row of the terrace agriculture, as Katie mentioned, we are proposing planting this Wayuu version of the 3 Sisters crops. So 3 Sisters crops are traditionally corn, beans, and squash. The Wayuu version is sorghum, cowpea, and cassava. Sorghum and cassava to cover the ground, prevent weeds, and retain moisture, and cowpea to climb the sorghum and fix nitrogen in the soil. Sorghum is a good substitute for corn. It takes less water and can also be used as an input for the biodigester. And cassava is highly drought resistant, not picky about soil. It's a cover crop, and it's a crop that's already familiar to the community. Next.
So studies have shown that in semi-arid climates, livestock grazing can lead to soil compaction and reduced vegetation cover. Intermittent grazing can alleviate some of the stresses and allow for greater conditions. Rotational grazing is widely used management process or practice, which is the sectioning off of the grazing area to concentrate the grazing for a specific period of time in one spot, allowing the remaining sections to grow. Since we have the 2 rows sectioned, and if we section them in half, that's 4 sections, and 7 days in each of these quadrants would allow 21 days to replenish. There's also a relevant study on goat lactation that was performed in southern Mexico that shows great benefits of using native vegetation as fodder, as opposed to a grass monoculture system. It showed greater contents of protein, fat, and minerals. And so the native vegetation is recommended for this application. Next. And these are a few of the native plants that, when they're able to flourish, can provide fodder for the goats. They're all native to the area, are somewhat drought tolerant, and can be planted or transplanted to this agrovoltaic area. The trupolo is a very common site in La Guajira, is nitrogen fixing and can provide protein for the goats. So each of these are trees, but they can be pruned to be shrubs so that they don't disrupt the panel efficiency. Next. So scaling back to the overview of the agriculture and animal husbandry system, we see that the natural inputs are sun, sea, and atmosphere. The Seawater Greenhouse interior and exterior provide different crops for the restaurant and local consumption, as does the Agrovoltaics cropping. The Agrovoltaics also provide sustenance for goats, which will in turn provide dairy and meat for the restaurants and locals as well. Seaweed cultivation provides product for regional sales. Thank you. Next.
So our team is going to present on the eco-enterprise and ethno-eco-tourism aspect of this project. And our goals included developing ways to promote tourism at this site using education, food, craft markets, and co-working cross-cultural farming activities while using culturally appropriate accommodations. We also included a micro-enterprise in food preservation, production of traditional medicines, their local drink, chirinchi, and salt curing of fish and food, and all with the primary goal of improving the livelihood of the Wayuu community through job creation. Next.
So here we're looking at La Guajira and popular destinations in the area. The main commercial airport is in Rio Hacha. So tourists will typically stay there or start a multi-day tour there. In pink, we show a typical tour route to highlight that our site falls in that path and can be easily added as a destination or stopping point on existing tours. We also identified a bird watching route because Colombia has the greatest number of bird species in the world, so that attracts bird watchers. Next slide.
Here we have an example welcome brochure for our site. We have made a list of activities you can do while visiting our site, whether you came here on your own or as a stop on one of the tours. As you can see from this list of diverse offerings, you can make it as active, intellectual, or as relaxed of a trip as you desire. Most importantly, I would like to point out the quality and mindfulness of all our activities. The original goal of tourism was to not only be a source of revenue, but also benefit the local community. Often large resorts fall away from this. We kept heritage, culture, and the natural world of our site at the forefront of our plans when designing these activities. All of our proposed activities are meant to help La Guajira land prosper, the Wayuu flourish, to create jobs, and to bring awareness to visitors. We do this with a multitude of learning activities following a concept called Regenerative Tourism. At our site, you can have just as much fun and relaxation as any resort, but in a meaningful way. A typical day could look like helping out at the Seawater Greenhouse, taking a cooking class led by a Wayuu, using locally grown produce, biking to a traditional storytelling event, and then sipping some local chirinchi from the on-site distillery in a hand-woven handbook. Next slide.
The Ecotourism Park is located approximately 500 feet from the beach, adjacent to the Seawater Greenhouse. The gray path we see on this picture connects the interior of the park with the main road on the site. Designed mainly for bicycles, considering these are the common transportation means by the locals. However, the 10-feet width of the way also lets other vehicles to move through the site when needed, especially during construction. While laying out the site, we consider vegetation to create shadow, keeping in mind the views towards the sea open. In addition, we notice existing structures has a wall that protects them from the prevailing winds coming from the northeast. So we added one to the Eco Park as well. The program includes a cultural center, a satellite school, a market, eco rancherias for lodging, among other features that we'll explain in the next slides. Next.
So in keeping with local building design and materials, all of the proposed buildings are very simple and use locally sourced traditional materials. So there's cactus for the structure, palm leaves for the roof, and rope made from recycling tires as a reinforcement for securing building components, which is an existing technique. Each individual hotel building accommodates 2 to 4 people, with 1 queen bed for 2 people or 2 bunk beds to accommodate 4 people. And the total capacity of our site is 26 visitors. There's minimal energy required, just lighting and access to a portable charging station. and the bathrooms are in a separate building nearby. Next slide. So this is a multifunctional open air space that serves as a kitchen, a distillery for making the local drink called Chirinchi that we mentioned before, and a flexible space to be used as a restaurant, bar, and host other activities. The materials are locally sourced again, and external energy is required mainly for lighting. In the kitchen, a solar fridge will be used for food storage, and adjacent to the kitchen outside is a solar food dehydrator, which we'll discuss further on the next slide. Next slide.
So the two tools mentioned by Olivia that we would use to help store food that would be consumed and sold are the solar food dehydrator and the solar refrigerator. This would help store food for longer periods and reduce post-harvest losses, which could help with food security. So the solar food dehydrator is used for food preservation. It uses the natural process of rising hot air, so it eliminates the need for electricity. And it also dries without direct sunlight, so the food keeps its nutritional value. It consists of a solar collector, which is the bottom portion here, that catches the light and it converts it to heat as the air passes through. And then the drying cabinet at the top, and as air travels to the top through the cabinet, it dries thinly sliced food that is placed on the mesh trays that you can see on the left. This is relatively inexpensive to build. The cost and materials for a dehydrator like this would be around $300, and it can dry about 10 pounds of food in 2 days or 5 pounds in 1 day. And the other is a solar refrigerator, which was also inspired by solar fridges that are used in another site in northern La Guajira, which isn't, but instead we're using a newer, more efficient model that only requires 1 solar panel, 1 battery, and 1 charge controller. And it works in most climates. It can work efficiently in ambient temperatures of up to 109 degrees. Next slide.
In order to support the local economy and educate tourists, we've developed a space for cultural exchange between locals and tourists, integrated with market. The products sold at the market are either traditional crafts created by the Wayuu, or they're taken as outputs from other sectors being developed in our collective plan. Weaving is a very important part of the Wayuu culture. So on the right side here, there's a covered outdoor market to display the woven goods for sale. And to the left of that is a space where the local women can teach their craft in small group workshops. The large building on the left is a multifunctional space where educational demonstrations and classes can be held, which we'll detail further on the next slide.
Productive land, thriving eco-enterprises, happy and healthy Wayuu people, and a respected culture are all nurtured by good education. As shown in our layout, the Cultural Center is one of the first buildings at the Eco-Tourism Park. Here you will have information on the history, design process, and construction of our site. You can learn about how each feature was intentionally chosen and how they work together in a circular fashion. This center will also serve as a workshop where you can learn weaving, the Wayuu can write poetry, or organize cultural activities. There's 1 school on site. Here there will be classes uniquely for the locals and for visiting students. However, there will be a lot of synergies between the two. Proposed classes benefiting the Wayuu people include Spanish, soil management, rainwater catchment, livestock rotation, building techniques, and health programs. Classes for college students involve hands-on learning with renewable energy systems, anthropology, and teaching. Furthermore, a partnership with the established University of La Guajira would align shared interests, as they already have an emphasis on sustainable development in their curriculum. Learning opportunities at our site are not limited to these buildings. You can learn native cooking techniques in the restaurant, La Yona dancing in the lawns, and work on the farm retreats. These are very unique learning experiences set our site apart from others, and most importantly, help sustain the area. Next slide.
So now we'll talk about some of the products available. at the market and in our restaurant, starting with some of the food products that the ag team was talking about earlier, coming from the Seawater Greenhouse, as well as local food supplies, fish, goat, rice and beans, really the kind of the staples of the Wayuu diet, and probably what we're going to want to feature in our restaurant. Woven crafts present a wonderful marketing opportunity. They're, you can see from the picture, bags and hammocks especially. It's a pretty well-developed industry. They're, you know, you can find these bags for sale all over the world. They're beautiful. Each unique piece tells its own story. The chirinchi, we'll get into that in a little bit. Salt and seaweed. Yeah, I think Christina talked about seaweed earlier. Salt presents a possible opportunity, as well as succulents, and we'll talk about that now. Next slide, please. So some of the native plants from the area, aloe does grow. It's not marketed that anywhere near where we are, but we think it does present a great opportunity because it is suited to these conditions, arid, sandy soil. You know, short term, we're thinking a pilot project on our site for locals and also for tourists coming through. It may have some sunburn issues, but long term, there are case studies from all over the world with some partnerships that show really strong development potential there. Native cacti as well are pretty important to the Wayuu culture for nutritional and medicinal purposes. A lot of other traditional medicines too, herbal remedies. You see a long list on the right, each with its own particular use. You know, it's a pretty hot area, these herbal medicines, see in the literature, and we think it presents an opportunity for teaching our tourists to come through and maybe some marketing opportunities long-term as well. Next slide, please. The chirinchi or yochi in Wayuunaki is their artisanal rum, water and brown sugar, locally produced, vanilla. A little bit of yeast is all you need. It's a really strong part of the culture. You see it, it's used in ceremonies, especially weddings, funerals. Again, we're thinking to start off small with production on campus to kind of, it's education. It's fun to have a little rum in the restaurant at the end of the day, right? But long term, again, presents another opportunity. There is a company, Asawa, in the area that's developing a product. So perhaps we can, and they're doing it really sustainably, trying to develop the Wayuu, trying to employ Wayuu. So maybe we can partner with them someday to help us both out, help them develop their marketing plans and help us hire some folks. And now I think Adelia is going to talk to you about agro-tourism. Next slide, please.
Yes, so we also propose incorporating agro-tourism through working farm retreats in which people can lodge for a period of time and stay to volunteer and work with the farmers while learning from them, so it becomes a community activity. While our Rancheria can host up to 26, we recommend a maximum of 10 to 12 tourists at one time so that they can support the farmers and not overwhelm their day-to-day work. Tourists doing Guajira multi-day tours that we mentioned in the beginning or staying at larger hotels in the area are also potential visitors for the farm retreats. And as opposed to the tourists who are just passing by on a Guajira multi-day routes, tourists in the retreats are staying for multiple days so they can participate in our other activities that we mentioned, like the education center, weaving workshop, dance classing, or just visiting the beach. So this can help drive tourists to our markets and welcome them into participating into different Wayuu traditions. Locals in the Guajira community can also participate and learn farming practices as well as locals in the greater area outside of the Wayuu community. This exercise is also an opportunity to partner with the Seawater Greenhouse, offering a way for tourists to also volunteer there. It's overall a way to participate in tourist activities while learning and contributing to the community development. Next.
In conclusion, to create a circular system, we try to create the most of the local resources and take advantage of the outputs of other systems on the site, as is the case of the permaculture, mariculture, and seawater greenhouse that fits into our locally produced articles that will further be displayed and sold at the local market, restaurant, and eco hotel. In addition to commerce, we propose visitors can learn at a cultural center, community activities, and a satellite school where they can study the site systems as well as learn the local craft, proposing a site that is recreational, educational, and self-sustainable. Next.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Our group is going to be talking about the energy production systems. The idea behind this is to create a self-sufficient grid that is autonomous and independent from the national grid, and to take advantage of clean energy sources and empower local employment. So the objectives are to use off-grid renewable energy to power the eco park facilities, minimize intrusive features to respect local culture, use off-the-shelf materials and technologies, and provide basic training for local operation for the assets. Next slide, please. So we are taking advantage of three main renewable sources, which are solar energy, wind, and biogas. And the only non-renewable energy we're using is diesel generator. With those sources, we are feeding microgrid number 1, you can see in the diagram, which provides energy for the eco park, the tourism, the educational activities and market, and the seaweed greenhouse, and also provides energy to a charging station for remote residents to come and charge their batteries to feed the electronic devices at their places. And this is going to be connected to a second microgrid, which will come in phase 2. Which involves the army base existing in upper place of the site, and we will be building a wind turbine close to the army base to create this second microgrid. Next.
Okay, so energy is the lifeblood of any society, and in indigenous communities and remote regions, there's no exception to that. Currently, there's dependence on distant energy production systems, and there's problems with distribution to remote areas. Colombia currently has a national integrated energy system, and 45% of the dwellings located in rural areas of La Guajira do not have access to electricity. Only 45% of the dwellings have access to electricity. And this can be due to various reasons. A lot of it has to do with the distances and the accessibility to the connection to the national integrated system. The NIS usually brings high electricity supply costs. And really our focus here was to create energy on a localized scale that could be useful for the population and bring opportunity. So first we have a autonomous photovoltaic system, and this is going to meet the greater needs of the eco-industrial park and fill some of the needs of the rancherias as well. This PV farm will facilitate the agrovoltaics that Katie mentioned earlier in the presentation. And it really seeks to add sustainable development into the region by reducing local and global atmospheric emissions from fossil fuels and provide electricity and opportunity to the indigenous Wayuu people. Next, we're proposing distributed solar energy, and this is going to be 1 to 2 panels, very minimal at each rancheria, and that is just to supply their baseline needs in terms of lighting. And really these solar systems are addressing the positive feedback loops of no electricity. So it creates greater welfare issues when you don't have electricity, such as lack of water and food supply, there's no way to have water treatment, medicine, or food storage, and use of fans and things like that. So it really exacerbates the risk of the population. And our goal here is to provide low-tech systems that can be readily maintained by trained expertise. Our focus was to meet the community's needs and provide further opportunity for their resilience, while also respecting their culture. Next slide. So why solar? So in La Guajira, they have the greatest potential out of any department for solar radiation in all of Colombia. Our site location specifically averages roughly 6 to 6.5 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day of solar radiation potential. And the minimum, so the lowest level of solar radiation potential falls within the October to December months, and that still provides 5 to 5.5 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day. So it's still relatively high potential throughout the year. And other factors that feed into this is, there's not a lot of shading, there's low cloud coverage, and the sun is always out. Next slide. So like Manel said, well, I'll talk to the system, the solar systems first, and then I'll talk about the phases of the energy connection in the microgrid. So the goal really is to have 2 solar PV farms. They're kind of split. So the one is, like Patty mentioned earlier, is going to be the 10 kilowatt system that's at the Seawater Greenhouse, and then we're going to have the 3 rows of the 27 kilowatt proposed PV system for Agrovoltaics, and this will facilitate energy for the rancherias. There'll be a battery storage center that will be located right next to the wind turbine, and there'll also be charging stations closer to the eco-industrial park and the roadway. And so the way that we're proposing this is a 3-phase proposal. So the first phase is to just get the systems up and running so that they're self-sufficient. That was the main goal of putting the 10 kilowatt PV at the Seawater Greenhouse, just so it can get up and running, work on its own, and provide the water necessary for the population. That was really one of our biggest goals. And the 27 kilowatt system that's for the Agrovoltaics will supply energy for almost everything else. The second is we're going to introduce the microgrid, and this microgrid will just be specifically in our project site. So interconnecting all of the energy systems, whether it be the wind turbine, the Seawater Greenhouse, the PV system at the Agrovoltaics, to the greater community. And then there's a possible phase 3 where we possibly could connect to the national integrated system. That's more so based on things like costs and that for feasibility. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to break down specifically the 27 kilowatt PV system that's facilitating energy for the greater need of the eco-industrial park and the population in our project site. There's going to be 108 250 watt PV modules, and Katie kind of broke that down for you earlier, so I'm not going to touch too much to that, but
yeah, Joe, just give this a light touch.
Yeah, okay, so basically basically the different components of the system is going to be the PV generators. So that consists of the PV modules and the mounting structures, things of that nature. We're going to have the storage system, which will be the battery storage center. And then the various needs for converters and such to convert the energy and for electricity purposes. Essentially, for all of that, our initial investment is going to be just under $50,000 US. And at the battery storage center, there'll be 50 lead acid batteries, so similar to the system at the Seawater Greenhouse. So that's kind of just the breakdown of solar. And now I'll pass it along to Presley, and she'll talk to you about wind.
Okay, so looking at La Guajira as a whole, these maps show the monthly wind speeds for the department. Trade winds predominantly come from the north and the northwest, with average speeds ranging from 8 to 12 meters per second. These wind speeds in the flat elevations make the area very desirable for large utility scale wind projects, like the Jeparachi Wind Farm, which is located very close to our site and touched on briefly earlier in the presentation. The main problem for these utility scale wind projects is transmission of energy back to population centers, because La Guajira is so far away from these population centers. But it is worth mentioning because the area does have major interest from wind developers. For our site specifically, we're going to be looking at community scale wind as a reliable supplement for our proposed PV arrays and the existing diesel generators that are being used on site. Next slide, please. So we decided to propose one wind turbine between 100 and 200 kilowatts in capacity to be located at the geographical high point of our site. I used NASA power data and was able to compile average monthly wind speeds from 1981 to 2018 at the exact point, which is marked here on the screen, of the high point for our site. At this exact location, we see the lowest capacity for wind speeds being from August to December, with a low wind speed of 7.2 meters per second. The peak is from May to August with a high of 10.7 meters per second. And then the average on site is 9.3 meters per second. And these numbers were all recorded at a height of 50 meters. Next slide, please. So the proposed turbine that we went with is the Vergnet GEV MPC. It's a 2-blade turbine with a hub height of 55 meters. So that wind data that I touched on before is fairly accurate for this height of turbine. One of the main reasons for choosing this turbine is its ability to be raised and lowered by just 2 people in under an hour. So when the turbine is lowered, it can withstand Category 4 hurricane winds or wind speeds up to 80 meters per second. Its lowering ability also allows for easier ground level maintenance. It also has a very small foundation using only 15 cubic meters of concrete, so we're limiting the amount of external materials we're bringing on site. And this is about 80% less concrete than comparable turbines. It's also ideal for marine environments, able to withstand a wide range of temperatures and up to 100% relative humidity. So at our average wind speed of 9.3-ish meters per second, we get a power output of 141 to 164 kilowatts. These are from the manufacturer, and they're the power curve for this turbine. At the hub height, which is again 55 meters, and using our average wind speed of around 9 meters per second, we get an annual gross production of 1,176 megawatt hours per year. So that's kind of wrapping it up for wind. Next slide.
So the biogas system is based on the use of a biogas reactor to collect, store, and treat different inputs, including food waste, such as vegetable and fruit waste, animal manure, and human excreta. Large quantities of biogas can be produced if animal manure is co-digested with the black water, whereas significant gas production will not be achieved from human excreta alone. The biogas produced can be mainly used for cooking and lighting, and the sludge is a nutrient-rich and good fertilizer that can be applied in agriculture. However, it is not pathogen-free, and additional treatment may be required before application. Next. These tables describe the daily biogas potential for the most common feedstocks available. For optimal biogas production, water must usually be added to the waste, put into the digester, and the added water volume can be assumed to equal the feedstock volume. When produced at a household level, the biogas is most suitable for cooking, and the household energy demand is influenced by cooking and heating habits, but in general, each person requires approximately 0.5 cubic meters of biogas daily. However, this depends on the stove design and the methane content of the biogas. Next. These calculations show the required animal manure from pigs and goats, the human excreta, food waste, and water for a daily production of approximately 13.5 cubic meters of biogas. The section diagrams explains how the proposed underground biodigester functions. The gas forms in the slurry and collects at the top of the chamber. Mixing the slurry as it rises. As gas is generated, it exerts pressure and displaces the slurry upward into the expansion chamber. The reactor is directly connected to public toilets with an additional access point for animal manure and in order to produce enough biogas for cooking and serve approximately 25 to 30 people, there should be a daily production of 13.5 cubic meters of biogas. This technology is easily adaptable and can be applied in the eco park to provide cooking gas for the main kitchen. This plan diagram shows the proposed design of a 15 cubic meters fixed dome biodigester located in proximity to the public bathrooms. The biogas reactor has a low construction investment and requires various more operational and maintenance costs. The total estimate to build this system is approximately $1,000 to $1,300, which is around 4 million to 5 million Colombian pesos. Next.
And this diagram is just a summary of what my partners have explained now. So we have here the organization, the conceptual organization of the energy sources, and the main microgrid, which feeds the ecotourism market, restaurant, and the educational space, and the Seawater Greenhouse, and also feeds the charging station, which allows dwellers or remote residents to come and charge their batteries, with a further connection to a second microgrid that would involve the wind turbine and the military base, and with a possible connection to the national grid in the future. Next.
So as you can see here, you can see like a site plan of our eco-industrial park. Manel, I don't know if you were going to explain this.
No, I didn't add this slide.
Okay. No, sorry, since you said next. Okay, so this is the site plan, and as you can see, you find towards the northwestern part of the park, you find the Seawater Greenhouse with the different crops and agricultural components that the previous groups found. We see the connection of the animal husbandry and the rotation of the animals. And we also see the integration of the market, the cultural space, the eco hubs, and the place where the community can actually integrate and find a space to collaborate, educate, and be together. And finally, you see towards the north the placement of the seaweed cultivation, and like as you saw everyone throughout the group, the multiple components of the project, the importance to highlight is the integration of all of these to maximize the efficiency of resources, energy, water, agriculture, outputs, and the exchange between the Wayuu people and the visitors and tourists, and providing multiple jobs and opportunities for the people. So I find that all of you guys did a fantastic job, I needed to say. Hilary, I don't know if you want to add something.
We'll pause on this. There's a final slide, but I want to give an opportunity for our reviewers. They've seen a lot of information, and we hope that they have some comments to render about the project in general. As you know, this was an academic study, and so it was basically research without access to the people who live there. If you just pause on the next slide, there's a final slide, and we can, I thought it would be useful to itemize the Sustainable Development Goals that the project addresses. So with that, if I can invite comments, I would urge Jim. Maybe Jim, you want to kick it off, followed by Michael, Bopner, and Catherine, and then Michael Duffy.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the team needs to be congratulated because I'm overwhelmed. That was a very sophisticated and complex and detailed proposal. You made the comments initially that it would certainly require local buy-in, particularly if you're looking for a collaborative project here. Couple of comments, I guess. I know Joe talked a little bit about the staging of the solar energy system. Have you guys given thought to how the larger project would be staged in terms of step 1, step 2, or phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? Given the breadth of what you're proposing, this kind of project would take, I assume, several years, but maybe I'm mistaken or naive. I'm also wondering if there had been any other previous collaborative efforts to improve livelihood among this community. As a geographer and as a social scientist, and with the experience I have, I've seen initiatives like this that have been very, very well planned, but that have failed because they fail to get local community buy-in. They fail to take into account maybe the local history or the local context. I'll stop with that. I think that's enough for you to reflect on or maybe to respond to, if you can.
Veronica or Nuri, feel free to respond quickly.
Hi. So previously, several of the students and Nuri and I and Hilary, kind of like a lot of the solutions that were proposed in this site were based on projects that were already from projects that people already did in La Guajira, right? By other organizations, like some solar steels, like different agricultural techniques. But since we didn't have access to the community, we were kind of partnering with different people from Colombia who had like a cultural knowledge of the Wayuu in order to start asking questions and understand this culture better, right? So for example, one of the people that we partnered with was Alejandro Fajardo, which he's here in this call, actually watching the presentation. and he has been working with the community for 10 years. So he kind of has like an understanding of how they work. But as you mentioned, if this project is to be developed, the first step is to actually run the project, not even the concept idea that we already have, like, but to start from scratch without having like an entire project already built, and start collaborating and co-creating with the community. So basically in Colombia, what has been a problem is not actually building stuff, but maintaining them throughout the time, right? So finding a budget to build a water tank or something by an enterprise is not that hard, so everyone is like able to give some dollars, right, or thousands of dollars, but there's no one who is up to checking back again if the equipment is running, if it breaks up and needs repairment, if the people are using it properly, if it's working or not. So they build stuff, and by the period of 1 or 3 years, they're no longer running. So that's the main problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. And we'll let you think of other things as the conversation proceeds if you want. Michael Bacher, are you with us?
Yes, I am. So I too want to congratulate the team. This was very richly developed, very detailed, lots of strong details, and really quite interesting. So good job. I was going to ask that same question about acceptance, local acceptance, especially around dietary issues. You know, you said you have a greenhouse with a temperate crop. I thought you answered that pretty well. You know, I had the question before you provided the answer reasonably well, I thought. So good job there. I did not. One thing I was surprised. You're right on the coast. I did not see, unless I nodded off for a minute, I didn't see anything about protection of the site, coastal resilience and protection of the site. You're trying to build some infrastructure into this site, fairly expensive in relation to the community, and I didn't hear that considered. So that surprised me. I didn't hear any mention of local governance. So going back to this question of adoption of the project, of how you would go back and work with the community, and I accept, Veronica, you mentioned going back and starting from ground zero to co-create to get buy-in, that's right, but I didn't hear anything about the local governance and you know, what that looks like, so you would know how to plan that approach to this kind of a project. So maybe not part of the project proper, but I didn't hear that attention to governance. And then the engineer in me, while I really like the idea that the microgrid concept was well developed, the different pieces were well developed, I didn't see a clearly developed energy balance. You know, we're going to have so much energy for these specific loads. These are the loads that we're anticipating. This is our production. So for example, you said you have a 10 and a 27 kilowatt PV system, but I have no idea how you came to those requirements, to that requirement for the project. How many people it's supporting, the microgrids are supporting, how much power each gets. Early on, there was a mention of supporting 5 hours of stove time for 65 goats. I mean, is that what the project is about? Later on in the energy presentation, you know, you show the digester again. Is that sized at 65 goats, or are there several of these? Is there, you know, how much of the tourist industry is going to be served by this infrastructure, by the water that you might need? These questions were they were addressed in pockets and pieces and bits, but there was no really coherent view of the project in that, from that engineering sense of an energy balance. So that would be an area to improve.
And I think a lot of the things that you've touched on also are sort of next phase potential issues to address. Clearly, the governance needs to take into consideration the local power structure, the matriarchal society, the development of contacts with some of the key leadership in this particular clan area would be instrumental. So thank you. But the energy balance, I think, is correct. You know, again, we were operating with certain assumptions in order to size systems that really had more to do with, you know, powering the greenhouse. And yes, I think overall one would have to figure out the demand, the fairly minimal demand aside from the greenhouse. And
okay, but even if you're working on assumptions, those assumptions should be clear and consolidated somewhere.
Good. Okay. Can we move to Catherine, if you have some comments you'd like to share?
Sure. I would also like to echo what others have said, that this was an incredibly thorough case study, perhaps the most thorough I've ever seen. So congratulations to the team on that. I did have a question. So this only came to my mind when you started mentioning tourism, people coming from elsewhere, and you have sort of this pretty valuable like battery infrastructure and stuff on the site. Was there any consideration for security or for sort of siting things away from where people would be congregating who were not used to this infrastructure or did not know what they were seeing, or if they did know, knew a little too much about its value? And my other just general question was also about coastal resiliency. I don't know much about this area, so I don't know if it's prone to cyclones, but if that was at all a consideration, considering you're dealing with desalination. And finally, just a brief comment. You're dealing with so much information here. It was truly, it's put together very, very well, but when it comes to putting data on slides, sometimes less is more. Just for students to keep in mind for the future as we all use PowerPoint for our entire careers. It's better to over-explain verbally than have too much to look at, just a general comment. But I know you're dealing with like so much information, and it was handled and communicated very excellently. So great work.
Great, thank you. Michael Duffy, if you're with us, you may need to unmute yourself.
I think that I'm unmuted. Earlier, my cat unmuted me inadvertently. So at risk of echoing the echoes, I also want to congratulate everyone on this. You know, I've done a similar project. I was in this class a few years ago, and we worked on a site that was facing similar challenges. And I'm impressed by the extent of the technologies that you've included, of the nuance and how you've articulated them. I think it's a much more comprehensive approach than we took. And so I'm definitely impressed by that. I also, sort of as the last commentator, risk echoing some of the questions and the thoughts of those who've spoken before. I was also thinking a lot about buy-in and about the locals and the governance structure, and even a little bit about the sort of physical geography. I saw on an earlier slide that the population is about 400,000. But I'm curious as to how that population is distributed and whether this is going to be located in kind of a denser population cluster or a more rural area. So that was one thing that I was thinking about, is, you know, what extent of the population is this going to serve? Is it scalable if it's successful? Another thing that I was thinking about was also the resiliency question. And, you know, I've been doing some reading recently about the idea of compounding shocks to the system, particularly in light of what we're all going through right now. And looking at climate events, there's a cyclone that's striking the eastern coast of India that is kind of a decade-level storm. Michigan is experiencing flooding right now. So how do you sort of plan for resiliency when the possibility of multiple shocks is something that's really plausible, especially when you're working in an already climatically stressed area? So I'm curious as to whether you've thought about that at all, or whether you think the design of the project as it stands, because it's so distributed and localized, is itself kind of an answer to that question.
Yeah, really, really excellent comments. Thank you. I'm just going to respond for the group. I think we did not really give a lot of attention to the issue of resiliency. It's a very flat area. I think we need to think more about this. We were looking at, some possible local flooding in the area and raising up the structures out of harm's way, and that was something that maybe didn't show yet in the plan. And certainly, I think the safeguarding of the most valuable and expensive pieces of equipment has to be really given due consideration. The greenhouse itself is, very, very simple materials. It could probably, in a storm, the canvas can be removed or better tied down. So there are a lot of things that would have to be much more closely focused on in order to obtain real resiliency. The Warka towers also are very lightweight and may need to be collapsed in the event of a storm. So yeah, thank you for those important comments, and those have to be taken into consideration. So I don't know whether there have been any items added to the chat function. I don't seem to see anybody in the group chat, but if there's a member of the audience that would like to unmute themselves and ask a final question or two, we'd be happy to entertain that. I have a feeling we've really out-zoomed ourselves for today. And I just want to say a word about, I really want to thank the reviewers for sitting through this. This was the first time we did this as a combined presentation. It would have to go a lot brisker, clearly. But thank you for your forbearance in going through this. I just want to thank very strong kudos to all the students who put a lot of effort and passion into this, and I really, really admire their contribution, and also to Nuri and Veronica, who I believe will hope to see if this vision has an opportunity to come to life. So with that, I don't know where we are time-wise, but I suspect we're
we are at 6:48.
Perfect. So we have like a 10-minute break for the next series of presentations. But again, I want to thank Michael and Jim and Catherine for your astute remarks. And congratulations, well done, students. And I'll get the final submittals from you on your narratives, and look forward very much to being in touch shortly with all of you. We'll definitely keep in touch, and the book will be assembled over the summer. So I'm going to say goodnight and thanks, and really appreciate your thoughtful input to this.